Welcome to our plenary session, America in 2025. I'm the chair of this panel and a participant, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind. It's great to be with you all. This panel, as you can see, is a little different than what appears on paper. We had to shuffle this a little bit last minute. My colleague Theo Wold is detained on Air Force Intelligence Reserve business, and Mike Anton is at an undisclosed location in South Florida, or maybe in between there in Texas somewhere. We're going to speak, I think, for 12 or 15 minutes each in the following order. I'm going to lead off by talking about conservatism in 2025. Then we'll hear from Amy Wax on how we ought to think about the law in 2025. Then from Mike Waller on how to understand and think about the bureaucracy. Alex Alden on how to understand our national security strategy, or AIMS. And then we'll close out with my colleague Arthur Milikh on the question of culture, or a critique of culture, or you'll see. Let me introduce everyone. Amy Wax is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. I encourage you all to go look up her story if you don't know it. She's currently in the penalty box of modern wokeism at UPenn, but fighting like hell, and I hope we'll sue them for a lot of money. It probably already is. She's one of our most fearless academics these days, and we owe her a debt of gratitude, I think, for her courage and in her fight with Penn. She stripped the mask off the modern academy to reveal what it is. It's not a pedagogical project. It's not a hallowed institution of education in modern liberalism. It's really a revolutionary political ideology masquerading as that. And it's one that's at war with common sense, decency, civic health, and the American way of life. So good for Amy for helping more people to understand that fact. Mike Waller, an old friend of the Claremont Institute, is senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy. He's also a recovering academic of sorts. He's held positions at as the Walter and Leonard Lenore Annenberg Professor of International Communication at the Institute for World Politics, and he's taught as an instructor in many interesting places like the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, the JFK Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, and guest lectured at the FBI Academy, the Marine Corps University, National Defense University, etc. Mike is always interesting to hear from. Alexander Alden, also a prestigious and notable Lincoln Fellowship alum of the Claremont Institute. These days is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies. I served in the first Trump administration. Man, isn't it sweet to say the first Trump administration? It's official. It's just sinking in. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and Senior Director for Emerging Technologies and Director for Defense Policy at the NSC, and he also served as Special Assistant for Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Finally, last but not least, my colleague Arthur Milikh, the Executive Director of our Center for the American Way of Life in Washington. Arthur worked at the Heritage Foundation for many years before that, and on the House Armed Services Committee as a staffer before that. So let's get down to our topic. Excuse me. How should we think about conservatism in 2025? I think I would have answered this question a little bit differently if we hadn't on Tuesday witnessed the greatest, I would submit, political possibility for a rebirth of conservatism since the Reagan administration. If we hadn't won on Tuesday, the project of conservatism would have looked a lot bleaker, though it would have remained just as vital. I would be up here arguing for mainly a state-based, local, civil society strategy, and it would have emphasized the continuing counter-revolutionary orientation needed by conservatives and conservatism. Don't get me wrong, we're still only at the end of the beginning of any kind of counter-revolutionary strategy in America. Even though perhaps with a little bit of help from the hand of Providence, we are now poised on January 20th to exercise political authority with the entire federal apparatus in Republican political control. I think I just heard some eyes roll. To talk of control of the federal apparatus these days in Washington just because you win a presidential election and both houses of Congress is absurd. Let that sink in for a minute. We have our work cut out for us. So how should we orient ourselves as conservatives in 2025? The Reagan administration is illustrative. This is an old saw now, but it held a fusionist coalition together against two common enemies: Soviet communism abroad and unlimited government at home. The main macro constituencies of that fusionism, most of you know them well: libertarian or free market economic policy, neoconservatives newly converted to Reaganism, and the GOP, especially on the question of foreign policy, and the, for lack of a better blanket term, the religious right. I'd say that fusionism is now well outdated and in most cases cannot be resurrected. One big problem with it now that was not the case in the 1980s, I don't think, is the question of abortion and its position, or the pro-life movement, I should say, and its position within the coalition on the right. That is a difficult issue that we'll have to navigate, and I think the beginning of that is already causing some rifts, to say the least. There's no substitute for winning to help paper over rifts like that, but it'll be something that has to be dealt with. But we have a new common enemy, one that could knit a new fusionist coalition together, and it's the enemy within. If I may quote one of the more controversial lines from President Trump, or President-elect Trump's recent campaign, it triggered many of his critics on the Never Trump right and the woke left, who in their kind of fever dream of modern American politics insisted that we're back in 1933 in Germany. The claim is absurd, of course, and thank God, I think the common sense of the American people saw through it and rejected it. But Trump, of course, wasn't thinking of Hitler. He was just assessing the situation in front of him in a common sense way. And remember, Lincoln famously said that America would not be conquered by any foreign power, but rather would be find its end, if it did find it, through suicide, not from external pressure. So if you indulge me for a minute, I just want to quote a couple of essays, not at length, that I've written over the last couple years in the American mind, and then get down to concluding thoughts. So in January of 2023, the piece is called "What Must Be Done," I said the following, or wrote the following: "These are the stakes of the current and coming political fights. The rollback of this entrenched regime will require statesmanship of a high order. A multi-generational political coalition must be assembled, drawing and building upon current American electoral trends. National electoral successes will have to be secured at the presidential and congressional level, and shrewd political and policy reforms will need to be coordinated, advanced, sold to the public, passed, and implemented. Electoral successes for the right at the state level will have to be consolidated and expanded with the goal of restoring a robust federalism that hasn't existed for decades. Responsible and shrewd joint action by the national government and the state governments will be the best way to restore federalism." I think there's some prospects for that in some states big and small after Tuesday's expanded majorities and governorships. Barring the existence of responsible and shrewd national majorities, state legislatures, this is now in the future for us, we hope not too soon, state legislatures and governors will have to interpose themselves between the feds and the constituents in their states to protect their rights. That's the position we found ourselves in until this week, or really through December. I think many political and institutional muscles long atrophied after ill use or no use need to be built back up. But the good news is that this offers kind of a Herculean task and a lot of opportunity for men and women of distinction, Americans of distinction, to make their mark on the current age. The presidency is the main prize, but congressmen, senators, and especially enterprising governors will be indispensable. So we've seen a lot of this happen in recent years, dramatically 2 days ago. But I need to add to that list now, given what happened this week, or what's happened over recent months. Congressmen, senators, enterprising governors, all very important, although they need to get more enterprising and more ambitious. But we need to add to that list now leading businessmen, philanthropists, Charlie Kirk, Elon Musk. This is sort of the nuts and bolts of this emerging political majority, and the way that this coalition will endure is by drawing on the virtues and energies and creativity of people like that. I mean, the example of Pennsylvania is sort of amazing. I mean, this gay political activist Republican, Scott Pressler, went viral, and now it's hard to argue that he's not, with some help from Elon Musk, the reason that Pennsylvania has flipped back to red. I will add to that list as well an emerging new media, which we just witnessed in real time displace the legacy media, I would argue, as the primary opinion-shaping institution in America, especially for Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. So we could say, to represent this change, put some faces on it, I regret to inform Anderson Cooper, Jake Tapper, and Chuck Todd that Joe Rogan has entered the lobby and is moving to the C-suite. Not just Joe, of course, but as we all have seen some maybe preliminary assessments of this whole electoral strategy that Trump and his team undertook, I think there will be a lot of things to learn, and maybe the most remarkable thing is over the last, 3 months, significant inroads with Gen Z men. I think that's a great development. And as some of also the rise to full political maturity of Gen X, which I think is a very healthy development. So I just concluded that piece by saying, as we look to this 2024 race for the presidency, obviously written for it, what exactly to do in any of these areas will depend upon circumstances, authority, precedent, available resources, likelihood of success, and the rank ordering of priorities. All with a bow to that merciless taskmaster necessity. That means we need prudence. But it's clear at the outset, whatever we end up doing on any of these fronts, that any worthy candidate for the presidency, indeed any political leader of national prominence, needs first to understand the current crisis and orient himself accordingly. And then I just went through the sort of main issues that we ought to orient ourselves by: the cancerous spread of woke leftism, education, immigration, the administrative state, the Department of Justice and the FBI, foreign policy, economic policy. Okay, I mean, I just covered all the topics that anyone would do in national politics, but you get the idea. This cancerous ideology of wokeism is metastasizing. I think we put a bit of a stop to it and will continue to in the coming years. But America needs a normal party, either existing or new, that stands against the cultural jihad being waged against normal Americans' beauty and the American way of life. And so any party that wants to save their country needs to operate with a view to that common enemy. And that should, in a sense, orient how we think about all of our other problems. So, as I said at the beginning, I think we're at the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, I should say, of the fight to displace the new normal that has governed our politics in the post-Cold War era. That is to say, trading power back and forth. It's kind of an anomaly in American political history. The norm is actually one party dominating for a generation or so, or a generation and a half. And so the goal should be to get back to that. That's really how you fully reorient American politics. Reagan got close with Reagan and Bush, but even he admitted in his farewell address that he didn't quite effect a full Reagan revolution. So I think any governing coalition these days needs to start with the goal and work backwards, as I just said. So what should our goal be? We might as well start big, and given the rhetoric coming out of the transatlantic alliance of elites in recent years, I think it's pretty obvious the preservation of Western civilization is at stake. That's our goal. And you have to preserve it in the face of what's really a revolutionary racialized communism. Race communism, as the kids call it. I'll leave out the more outre term that some of them use. It really seeks the destruction of the American Constitution and way of life, justifying itself with the defamatory claim that America has always been and continues to be racist, sexist, homophobic, imperialist and colonialist, and transphobic. This movement of the left has radicalized since the 1960s, gaining momentum and becoming mainstream, at least in the academy in the 1990s, but then running on the jet fuel of anti-racism and anti-Trumpism and spilling out into the streets and across institutions since 2016, but especially since the summer of St. George Floyd in 2020. So I think any conservative or politician that cannot understand and accept the nature of this internal threat shouldn't be taken seriously as we enter the latest phase in the fight for America. My colleague Charles Kessler, in his recent book, The Crisis of the Two Constitutions, said, you know, the left or progressivism at the turn of the 20th century and really running through the 50s maybe, was post-constitutional. You know, it thought that its implicit philosophy was historicist. It thought we had overcome the problems of tyranny and we just needed to get about the business of scientifically guided public policy so that we could create heaven on earth. But the modern left is really anti-constitutional, and there's a million examples I could provide. One that my Claremont Institute board chairman likes to trot out is that the guy that Tim Walz picked to run the educational K through 12, I forget what segment of it, it was cultural studies or whatever, section of Minnesota's public education, is on tape fairly confidently and without shame saying, no, critical race theory is not about just understanding what racism is or spending a little more time talking about forgotten voices of color in American history. It's anti-state, it's anti-American, it wants to overthrow the American government. That's just one. His name's Lazansky, you can go look it up. So I think on matters of policy, this means that we must discard an inflexible allegiance to Reagan-era fusionism and its particular basket of policies, as if the prudent policy responses of the 80s to the necessity of the 80s has somehow been frozen in time as principles rather than as adaptations to the times. Now, that's not to say that we necessarily need to ditch all of that policy platform. It is to say that as the threat to the American way of life is new, we need to think anew while maintaining our goal of saving Western civilization and American constitutionalism. I think the most difficult thing for conservatives to think through clearly is what does a policy platform look like, especially on economic or trade policy, that serves and expands what seems to be a very promising expansion of the GOP's national constituency. And then as I mentioned at the outset, I'll throw abortion into the mix as well. Sam Francis, writing about Pat Buchanan's runs for the presidency in the 90s, liked to talk about a coalition of Mars, not Elon's Mars, but middle American radicals, as he called them. I think that should continue to be our orientation, although we need to update it for the emerging and expanding demographic realities of 2025 America and the GOP coalition. Middle America has been radicalized, I think, against our national elite institutions in the media, the academy, and the woke vanguard of the Democratic Party. A lot of them may not really understand the ways in which they're radicalized, but they saw it explicitly on offer, as much as the Harris campaign tried to become the campaign of joy and moderate responses to American problems. The people saw through it. And I think politically, conservatism in 2025 needs to expand, deepen, and entrench the political coalition of middle American radicals with the goal of a generation of political rule. I think that's the only way we really save our country, and we might be close to a last chance at it. And I think intellectually, the conservative movement and conservatism needs to help its political elites and governing elites and media elites. My colleague and longtime friend, Matt Peterson, used to joke that we need to mega before we MAGA. We need to make elites great again before we can make America great again. So the conservative movement needs to help its political elites understand their project as heir to the project of the American founding and secure their safety and happiness to ourselves and our posterity. So, thank you. Amy Wax.
Hello, and welcome. Thank you for asking me to speak today. My assigned topic here is the law in 2025 and beyond. There's a lot that I could potentially talk about, obviously. Lots of ways in which our laws and regulations have gone off the rails in recent years, and especially during Democratic administrations. But during the panel, I'm going to touch briefly on three topics: trends in criminal law and public order, abuses of the civil rights laws and what to do about them, and how the K-12 system and education in general should be reformed. Now, I'm not a criminal law expert, but I am a law professor and a citizen, and thus I am deeply concerned about the growing disorder in our cities and the lax excuse-making stance towards law-breaking of our left-leaning elite leaders, as well as my fellow academics, which is all informed by the pernicious woke dogma that has taken hold in our universities. And of course, I am from Philadelphia, so I am no stranger to squalor and disorder. Democrats and the mainstream media love to tell us that crime is down, but our eyes and experience inform us that it is still way too high, and also assault us daily with the menace around us. In the words of Steve Saylor, online pundit, we notice. I have taken to calling the Democrats the shoplifting party. Nationwide, blue prosecutors have declined to prosecute retail theft, resulting in brazen grab-and-go practices that have shops, small and large, reeling, and that lead them to put products like pet treats and antacids behind bars in their stores, with devastating effects on the retail sector and city life. And I was just in Denver, and I saw all of this in action, and it is sad and depressing and bleak. No wonder our young people are depressed. Even California voters have had enough. They have dealt a blow to the state's decade-long experiment with progressive criminal justice reform by overwhelmingly approving a tough-on-crime ballot measure that rolls back reduced sentences for a host of nonviolent crimes. And liberal Los Angeles ousted their high-profile progressive George Gascon, electing instead a Republican Nathan Hochman, who promised dramatic reforms and tightening up. Likewise, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, a very important decision, in the City of Boise case, in which the court reversed the Ninth Circuit's addled declaration that preventing people from sleeping in public places was somehow a violation of the Eighth Amendment, and we have Trump's sensible judges and appointments to thank for this, localities now have a much freer hand for dealing with homeless encampments and similar antisocial behaviors on our streets. We can hope and expect that municipalities will take advantage of those prerogatives to crack down on the disorder and blight created by overly lax attitudes towards people who are often mentally ill, high on drugs, and just plain menacing to the general public. New and aggressive policies are needed here, ones that channel Matt Iglesias' recent advice to the Democrats. Number 8 on his list of 9, please elevate the interests of normal people over the antisocial and the deviant. What about the abuse of the civil rights laws and the persistence, the stubborn persistence of race-based policies and practices in our society, in the universities, in professional schools, in the business world? I could go on and on. Since 2006, the Grutter case, And until the recent Students for Fair Admission Harvard affirmative action decision, universities were allowed to take race into account in their admissions practices, and it was assumed also in hiring, promotion, funding, all in the name of diversity and the supposed and completely made up pedagogical value of a diverse student population and teaching corps. Although the Supreme Court in the Harvard case shut down race-conscious decision-making, for the most part anyway, there is the famous Chief Justice Roberts loophole, the dirty and not so secret is that race-conscious practices persist today, and universities are determined to double down on their present practices. And not just in higher education. Corporations, nonprofits, government agencies, the entertainment sector, the arts, all continue to practice identity-based affirmative action in various forms and to shape their institutions in race and identity-conscious ways using diversity, equity, and inclusion, so-called DEI, as an excuse. And here's a little appreciated fact. Apart from education, these practices have never been legal. They have always violated the Constitution for public entities and the letter of various parts of the Civil Rights Act, which are colorblind and prohibit private and public action based on identity. The pedagogical benefits of diversity, which the court recognized for universities in the Grutter case, do not apply and never applied to entities like corporations and government agencies. At least the court has not recognized them as such. So their race-based policies have never been validated. The blatant illegalities of widespread race consciousness in hiring, promotion, government funding have been permitted and even promoted by past Democratic administrations who are all in favor of them. The Democrats will never crack down on such practices despite the law being against them. So much for democracy. But Republicans can and should reverse these trends. These practices are a fertile area for targeting by the executive branch of our new administration, and they should be a priority. They require more aggressive enforcement, especially in the university sector. Of course, Title VI, which conditions funding on compliance with the civil rights laws and colorblindness, turns out to be a potent tool for stricter enforcement against universities, both public and private. Even private universities receive hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government for student loans, fellowships, research funds, medical training, and the like. But a little-known fact, and one that needs much more publicity and attention, is that much of this money is skimmed off by universities for so-called overhead expenses, anything from paying electric bills to maintaining their vast, expensive, and mischievous DEI bureaucracies. Sometimes as much as 90% of the grant allotment goes to these functions, a very sweet deal for the universities. So in effect, taxpayer dollars are fueling the most pernicious and partisan aspects of our higher education establishment, which is completely captured by the left. And I'm in the belly of the beast, so I know what I'm talking about. One area where DEI initiatives have had an especially alarming effect is in medicine, and especially academic medicine, at our most prestigious institutions. Academic medicine is in fact all in for race-conscious programs in admissions, training, patient care, funding research, and the like. Medical schools like my own, UPenn, have adopted clear double standards based on race and identity, which has seriously diluted meritocratic practices in the process. For example, Penn allows special and less demanding admissions criteria for minority students. Graduates of historically black institutions do not have to take the MCAT, the medical college admission test that everyone else must take. They only need to complete certain courses and attend a summer program. You're probably looking at me in disbelief, but that is true. In addition, an alarming and growing percentage of our government grants for medical research are devoted not to curing diseases, but to addressing so-called disparities, the fact that some minorities, especially blacks, have worse medical outcomes than others. Now, the reasons for this are very complex. They go beyond the medical system or anything the system can really do. But medical research is nonetheless increasingly devoted to addressing these so-called social determinants of health using money and mandates from the federal government that would otherwise go for conventional scientific priorities. And students and young scientists are getting the message loud and clear. They are more and more abandoning difficult, basic, and therapeutic research in favor of faddish and fashionable projects that look at disparate outcomes, an exercise in most cases that amounts to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And all of this is being done without any proper vetting, without testing, validation, empirical examination, no definition of endpoints or metrics of success. All of the requirements that apply to other areas of medicine, interventions, treatments, and reforms. These are the gold standard for all clinical drug trials. But DEI counts itself exempted. So once again, we have double standards. We are expected to take it on faith that drastic DEI-related changes in the medical world are good and good for us, that they won't have destructive effects on our world-class medical system and establishment, will not diminish the quality of our medical care and of our scientific innovation, on which the rest of the world depends, because we are it in that area. Because none of this is properly proved or likely to be empirically established anytime soon, a Republican administration should crack down on these practices, which, as I said before, are blatantly illegal. At the very least, they should demand sound, high-quality evidence that these practices lead to better outcomes, far better proof than we have now. Now, those of you who are Supreme Court watchers know that Justice Ketanji Brown, in her dissent in the Harvard affirmative action case, cited a study that purports to show that black babies do better if their mothers are cared for by black doctors. In fact, this study shows no such thing, and yet it is cited over and over again. Critics have pointed out that this paper failed to use proper controls, resulting in misleading findings and invalidating the study. Sicker babies are more likely to be treated by high-risk specialists who are usually non-black, and those babies are more likely to die, like duh, right? So not controlling for how sick babies were distorts the results. This is just, regression 101. But the DEI world is oblivious to scientific validation. Extravagant claims are repeatedly made about how DEI initiatives help minorities and the disadvantaged and are essential to proper medical care. These claims should either be put to the test or DEI in medicine should be scrapped. And that is the task. That is the sacred task for a Republican administration. The future of our world-class medical establishment depends on it. Finally, I just want to say a couple of words about K through 12 education, which has become a hobby horse of mine. Because of what has been happening to me at Penn, I have been asked to speak a lot about education, and I have come to a not surprising conclusion. It all starts in kindergarten. The rot all starts in kindergarten. Now, the problem is K through 12 education is mainly the purview of states and localities. Although we have a federal Department of Education, and they can use the carrot of funding, they have some authority, they don't have a lot. Right now, though, we have a K through 12 curriculum, both in public and private schools, that is larded with partisan, age-inappropriate, and unnecessary subjects and instruction. Let's talk about sex. In my view, and I know this sounds radical, but it's actually the way I was educated back in Troy, New York in the 1950s. There should be no instruction on sex or gender in the schools, period. Save the most basic elements of biology, and even that introduced sparingly. Why is that? Sex is always moralized in every society. It is never neutral, and it is impossible to present it in a nonpartisan way. Thus, we must respect parental authority and prerogatives in this arena and leave the issue to private society. And that is the way that it was when I was back in public school, and that is a good model, as reactionary as it is. And even more especially for today, when there is even more disagreement than ever on the proper norms, rules, and models for behavior than there was back then. The controls exerted should include proper curation, not just of what is in the classroom, but also what is in school libraries. Now, this is not censorship. That word is a form of gaslighting. It is a propagandistic misnomer that the left has tried to impose on the rest of us. Don't let them. Parents have the right to expose their children to explicit materials anytime they want. These are available on the internet, through Amazon, and public libraries. Parents can teach their kids how to put on a condom, how to masturbate, all about gender fluidity, and how boys can become girls, and vice versa. What they do not have the right to do is expose other people's children to these concepts and materials. That is not censorship. That is respecting parental authority and privacy, and that comports with common sense. Second, we should have a far more balanced presentation of historical and racial issues. Children should not be taught that we are uniquely evil. Slavery and exploitation are common and widespread throughout history and cultures. The Indian and African tribes were not very nice to one another. Violence and appropriation are the way of the world and a staple of history. Third, without ignoring slavery and discrimination, we should de-emphasize racial identity and grievances and convey much more pride in Western civilization and its achievements, which are now tarnished as white supremacy. Young people are simply not exposed to the extent of Western and European contributions, which are outsized and unique. They are not encouraged to admire, respect, and venerate their own culture and country, which has accomplished so much. They are not encouraged to be proud. Once again, that is white supremacy. Finally, there should be far less emphasis on current affairs and controversies, and much more on basic skills and cultural transmission. Our Constitution, our institutions, what the founders thought and sought, and why they created our structured republic. K-12 should not be a debating society. Young children, even high school students, simply are not equipped to take on complex issues that are challenging enough for most adults. They don't have the background knowledge, the reasoning ability. They don't know what's at stake. Making these changes and reducing the current ambit and authority of government schools will actually free up time and energy for really important subjects like shop and home economics and finance, which everybody needs to know to function in this world. But how are these reforms going to take place? The problem, of course, is that although the Department of Education can try to bring about some changes, all of this has to happen locally. That means that school district by school district reform is necessary. It's onerous and challenging. As Oscar Wilde put it about democracy, it takes too many evenings. Nonetheless, whether we like it or not, the hostility to our American way of life and the indoctrination to lefty dogma, as I said, it starts in kindergarten. When young people ask my advice, what can I do? And I'm not talking about the progressive social justice types here. I say, get married, have children, join your school board, become advocates for a reactionary return to an older model, a better way, to the tried and true standards for doing things. Become moral entrepreneurs who try to convince others that what is happening now is not working because standards have fallen. Students don't know anything. And it's not in the interests of our nation. What is happening is not in the interests of our nation because our schools are not producing loyal and constructive citizens. My hope is that the Republican Party in power will back them up on this project, that they will realize what time it is, and that time is short on reforms for education. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Got all the education you need from Penn right in a few minutes. So the subject of bureaucracy is a very unpleasant one. We're looking at it from the national security side of the house, but you can apply it really to any federal bureaucracy, which is that in our country, it's become more like what you see in a one-party administrative state than even FDR had imagined with the New Deal. You have a self-perpetuating elite, single-minded in its ideological dogma that's constantly growing, constantly self-replicating, constantly consuming more funds and demanding more authority down to the most local and even intimate family levels. So if you take that as a general rule of what American bureaucracy is like, and you look at it, say, as the national security community as a microcosm, you see something that's even the worst element of all of a one-party administrative state. And that is you have what really amounts to a secret government, where you do not have a government that is governing with the consent of the governed, but quite the opposite, without the consent of the governed. You have a government bureaucracy that influences how we think every day, that influences how we behave every day, that, as we just heard, influences how our children think and believe and behave. And it's only getting worse. So imagine the national security side of it, where they hide behind secrecy. Really, every bureaucracy hides behind some sort of secrecy. Usually it's stalling or not being, fully truthful or whatever else. But imagine if you have it under the law, they are forbidden to tell you things. Or as you can see with the eunuch FBI director that we have, who really doesn't run the bureau, but you see the contempt that he has toward Congress when he decides he's had enough testifying. he has to make a flight to his vacation home. And of course, his flight is his executive jet, which can leave whenever he wishes, but he tells senators that he can no longer testify because he has to go. So you have the head of the FBI doing this with the Senate Oversight Committee. The stuff we can see, can you imagine what's there that we cannot see? The one time Chuck Schumer said something that was absolutely true was if you go after the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of coming after you. And we saw that happen before. But it doesn't have to be that way, especially if you can dissect it, if you know how it's built, you know how to take it apart and still keep the parts that are valuable for the national interest. So what you have then is a bureaucratic structure and a national security community that's supposed to be securing our nation, but has become, the way it operates, fundamentally un-American. So that's the nature of the bureaucracy and how it's become. The big problems, again, this is the national security side of the house, and it includes the military, the CIA, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, all the 3-letter places. They've become too big. They've become too unaccountable, because if you can have too unaccountable, they're not accountable at all. They're process-oriented. As long as they can keep a process going, it's like the State Department. They don't need to find a solution, because if they find a solution, that's too risky to find a solution. So keep the process going, whether it's Mideast peace process or arms control or whatever else, but it's the same thing within the intelligence community. Process, unaccountability, constant growth. You build your career, you retire as a GS-15 or as SES level, and then you go and quadruple and quintuple your salary by getting non-compete contracts to yourself by the people that you formerly supervised. And this is the business model for Washington, D.C., which is why, in some surveys, 9 of the 20 wealthiest counties in America are in the greater D.C. area. When there's no banking, there's no trade, there's no industry, there's nothing. It's all, the business model is taking money from the taxpayer and taking money from future generations to perpetuate those 9 wealthy counties in the country. So, the corruption is not the stealing kind of corruption that much. There's plenty of that, because most of it is legal. But it's still morally extremely corrupt. It's intellectually corrupt. It's corrupt in terms of fulfilling and abiding by the oath that they take to uphold the Constitution. It's nepotistic. You see generations of this going on now. It's ideologically corrupt. It hides behind secrecy, also not just to protect national secrets like they like to say, but to hide their own ineffectiveness and incompetence. For its huge budget, how many spies has the FBI actually caught who really matter in our lifetimes? The one counterintelligence role of the FBI. How many spies, real, and not ones that walked in or not ones that were surrendered over to us or something like that. How many real spies through real sleuthing did we capture who aren't, People's Liberation Army students who were given visas to study at MIT and steal secrets? But I mean real spies. How many? Maybe 10? Probably not. When you discount who betrayed their own countries to report these spies, so even Robert Hanssen, that wasn't FBI sleuthing. They never ever polygraphed Robert Hanssen in his whole career in the FBI, even after they discovered he might have been spying earlier. So it was a Russian walk-in who betrayed him. So you've got this huge counterintelligence community that doesn't do counterintelligence. And they hide behind that. They use secrecy to hide their ineffectiveness. The FBI has been so transformed that J. Edgar Hoover was the most benign FBI director compared to the FBI collective leadership that we have now. Imagine, he had no SWAT teams, he had no tactical units, he had no technology, he had no computers. The field offices started the investigations. He didn't start them from headquarters. Every special agent in charge of every of the 56 field offices could call him anytime they needed to talk to the director. You can't do that anymore. You have to go through 15 steps to do that. The United States is the only democratic country that has combined its federal law enforcement and its intelligence services into one entity after 9/11. So after 9/11, it became a domestic intelligence service with police powers. So being part of the DOJ, you now have DOJ as part of the intelligence community. That has not happened in countries west of East Germany. But it happened here. And here we are. Ineffective, corrupt, self-perpetuating, hiding behind secrecy, and then the other politically extremely abusive when you have them flagrantly violating not just laws. Every time you see a leak of classified information in the press, you know that somebody in the government with an oath to keep national security secrets has committed a felony. When's the last time you saw someone prosecuted for that? So you have lawless federal law enforcement. You have a CIA where it's so bad in there that Ghana, the West African country, was able to infiltrate the CIA. I said, sadly, it's not a joke. It's really true. So imagine what is this national security apparatus doing for us? We need it. We need counterintelligence. We don't have it. And then, of course, you have all of the overlapping bureaucracies. Why do you have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives and the FBI as a lead agency enforcing firearms and explosives? When you have the state police or the town police bust somebody, why is it that the FBI comes in, claims credit, takes over the investigation, drags it out for years, and often screws up the cases? But they're the first ones to put out press releases saying how they were part of this investigation so that they can, what? Fill in the boxes to get larger budgets and more authority. So even a lot of conservatives and MAGA people say, well, yeah, but if we just fix the first couple levels of the FBI, it will be fine. Ever go to their FBI jobs page on X? With the exception of computer experts, technology experts, and people who need real skills, it's all woke. They're just recruiting woke people as analysts and special agents. You can see it at FBI jobs. What are they doing this for? For an ideological purpose. It's like the radicals, the cultural Marxists, have taken over our national security institutions to weaponize against us. Yet find a majority of Republicans on a House or Senate Judiciary Committee who really want to change things at the FBI, let alone dismantle it and parcel it out so that we can have more effective services. So this is, again, the small picture of bureaucracy at large through the national security lens. So what do you do about it? First, you have to return power to the states. There's no need to have so many of these bureaucracies at a federal level when the states can do it. And where the states can't do it, why not give block grants from the budgets of, say, DOJ, so that the local smaller states can fund what they need to do. Then you need to go after those who attack and subvert our democratically elected leaders and our institutions. You need to slash the size of the apparatus. You don't need secret intelligence to spy on the climate and on gender. And so many other things. And you need to split them up. Not only push things down to the state level, but we don't need a Department of Homeland Security doing what it is and is not doing. You don't need the FBI anymore. It's just an old brand that J. Edgar Hoover made popular with Hollywood and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and it's the Bud Light of law enforcement. Let's detach from that attachment to those initials. Same thing with CIA. We need a good CIA. We don't have a good CIA. You can do a lot more with a whole lot less. Look at what the Israelis have done. Look what the French have done. We can do something like that too. And finally, one last parting note. We should really enforce the Uniform Code of Military Justice on former military officers who leak, who destroy, who lie. The Mike Haydens of the world, who use their rank to shut everybody else up, to shut everybody else down, and to mess with our democratic republic. They can be called back to military service, they can be demoted in rank, they can then be forcibly no longer be a retired four-star general, but now they're a former private. That's something that good leadership can do. And you can do other similar things with other parts of the bureaucracy also. And that's just the start. Thanks.
Well, that was quite a scene setter, and I'll start by telling you why I am violating a self-imposed rule here today, precisely for reasons that we've heard before. Anything and everything I say here today, on record, can and will be used against me. I'm fully aware of it because I've been on the receiving end of this in the past, and as well as on the giving end of it. I would like to now open up the topic of the purpose of our strategy. We discussed the element of national security internally, how we organize, how effective and or efficient we might be, and we are not as good as we should be. I'll talk about the external dimension of this, namely the purpose of U.S. strategy going into 2025. Let me basically give you some data points to understand the scope of the challenge. Since the end of World War II, the United States has made formal bilateral and multilateral treaty-like commitments to more than 60 countries in the world, covering about 25% of the world population and about 75% of total world economic output. We've incurred these obligations in a very specific historical moment. Again, like I said, after World War II, the beginning of the Cold War and the first phase of the Cold War, at a time when we had just about half of the world's GDP. And this challenge, there are many misgivings about how we went about this, but there was a vigorous debate about these choices. And there was a challenge specifically that we were trying to solve. And today we debate on these choices, but there was an ideological challenge, which is communism, as we all know, and there was a military challenge, the Soviet Union. Now, those two things correlated, but we have to understand that the communist challenge was broader than just the Soviet Union, was also an internal threat. And then there was the Red Army, which was a significant geostrategic potential aggressor that we had to look after. Now, look, at that point in time, we lived in a neighborhood where there might have been around 10 houses, and 5 of those 10 houses were ours, 50% of the world's GDP. And the other half, the other 5, were really, really in bad shape. So to a great extent, we had an interest in perhaps underwriting some of these global public goods because we were taking up the slack in the HOA, and we were paying the HOA fee pretty much for everyone. Now, fast forward to today, we own about 2 out of those 10 houses. The other 3 next to us are doing pretty well. There are another 5 still somewhat in disrepair, maybe 3 to 5 in disrepair. Yet, we're still mowing the lawn for everyone. We're still the only ones paying the HOA. And now we're confronted with this challenge, which is, I think our strategy's purpose will be to renegotiate our role in the world, to make it a more sustainable position, and to confront what is the challenge of strategic insolvency. This is also known as the Lippmann gap. We have these vast commitments that we've undertaken, and by the way, I'm not even counting the informal security commitments that we may have beyond the ones that are secured by treaty. So we have all these commitments on the one hand, and then we have decreasing resources that we can allocate against these commitments. Now, this is the Lippmann gap, this challenge of potential insolvency where we have obligations, we have liabilities that far exceed the assets that we have at our disposal as of right now. Now, the debate, even in our conservative movement, is in between those who want to increase the resources and the assets that we can bring to bear towards these obligations, and those who want to decrease these obligations to meet the willingness and the capabilities that we have at hand. This debate, to my mind, is a bit unfortunate because it seems to be a dialectic between those who want to do everything, everywhere, all the time, and those who would like not to do anything, anywhere, ever. Now, I think the first Trump administration, as Ryan pointed out, and the second Trump administration is negotiating this somewhere in the middle. Namely, there will be an intent, just like there was in the past, to increase our defense resources that we can bring to bear, but also to renegotiate some of these liabilities that we have. For instance, there's a deep question and a deep challenge by President Trump is the question of alliances. Are those assets or liabilities? We hear often that allies are one of the distinguishing aspects of America's role in the world, that we can bring to bear all these allies, and that's actually a source of strength. But we often find ourselves in discussions where it seems that is somewhat of a liability that we carry solely and squarely on our backs. This question, when it comes to Donald Trump, goes as far back as 1987. For those of you who may not be aware, in 1987, Donald Trump, out of his own pocket, took one-page ads in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, where he lambasted America's foreign policy and basically the challenge of the problem of allies free riding. At that time, squarely calling out Japan and Saudi Arabia. So this criticism of our allies not being able to carry their own weight, not doing the burden sharing, has been something that has been of concern, of interest of Donald Trump for a long time. And I would note one interesting aspect of this, which is 1987, whose foreign policy might he be criticizing? So in that same year, a very seminal book came out called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, which talked about decline of great powers in these cycles over 5 centuries. In reviewing this book, Samuel Huntington pointed out that the true expression of a great power is in its ability to renew the sources of its strength. The decline is not inevitable, and that since 1945 until that moment in the late 80s, there have been 5 waves of so-called declinism in the US debate. Oftentimes, maybe people who wished us to decline, oftentimes adversaries who also conveniently found it to see us declining. And so some could say that maybe that letter by Donald Trump was part of this expression of a certain concern of decline. But I'll submit to you that type of critique of US foreign policy is literally what Huntington meant by the secret of a great power is how it renews the sources of its strength. It's not just economic. It's also the fact that we are a very dynamic society, and we do have vigorous internal debates about obligations, commitments, resources that we can bring to bear. So that critique that Donald Trump offered to US foreign policy for the past 40 years is not necessarily to underwrite any concept of declinism, but basically to push against it. In fact, the motto is to make America great again. And the spirit there is not to be taken advantage of by basically shouldering all the burdens unilaterally without any concern, but to revisit what kind of adversarial relationships we engage in, who we choose as allies, and how do we make sure that the whole thing is solvent yet again. And I think that his position, and going forward we may see this in national security strategies that are to come, is quite pragmatic and in the historical tradition of American statecraft. To those who expect a deep retrenchment by the United States from the world, they will be disappointed. And to those who expect an exuberant involvement all over the place, they also will be disappointed. And I'll give you this in a very specific illustration, in a very concrete case, where different factions will want to see in the figure of Donald Trump what they kind of prefer ideologically, then they're bound to be disappointed. If you recall, in the first Trump administration, there were a lot of tensions with Iran. Well, first of all, there were tensions with North Korea as well, but then, the president escalated to de-escalate after the big buttons conversations became fast, interesting interlocutors. And in fact, let's never forget that he's the first president of the United States who visited North Korea. The Iran contingency. When the Iranians shut down an unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone in vernacular parlance, there were some advisors to the president who were very adamant in striking back, very aggressively. And in that context, reportedly, the president said that there would not be a, quote, proportional response, end quote, to which you may imagine all these advisors were scurrying around the White House to figure out who told them about proportional responses, because it was a very particular term of art. And so a lot of people thought, oh, Trump, he's an isolationist. He's just letting the Iranians get away with it and so forth, right? And some others were very, very relieved that he did not have intentions to escalate that confrontation. Not too long after that, there was a similar situation with the Iranians. Well, not that similar. There's a particular divergence there. The famous episode of the assassinations, taking out the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Qasem Soleimani. And in that context, those who wanted a confrontation with Iran welcomed this operation strongly and praised Trump for being ready and aggressive to strike. And those who previously were cheering him for his restraint in the context of the drone were highly disappointed because they were expecting a potential escalation. But what was the difference? He assessed these types of situations on a case-by-case basis, looking at important aspects, namely the U.S. national interest and the safety of Americans. In the second case, where there was a more aggressive response, there was a critical element. Reportedly, there were American lives at risk, and that justified that type of decision, whereas in the previous case, there were not. So that, in a way, to me, summarizes this America First approach, which is not to be confused by that which critics of Donald Trump portrayed us to be, which is some sort of neo-isolationism. But an actual approach is pragmatic and rooted in the value proposition for the United States of America of any given action or any given initiative, and clearly defending American lives and being responsible caretakers of the American Treasury. So in that context, I submit to you that the Trump strategy will return to a very pragmatic approach to American statecraft, again, like I said before, but will be in a way done that makes the United States stand in a more solvent position to actually exert its interest abroad. I think that what you will see will be a lot of surprising elements, such as many people were telling us that Donald Trump will be very, very accommodating to Russia. I think that's highly mistaken. I think he potentially will be stronger facing Russia, not because of perhaps some geostrategic elements, but basically because of geoeconomics. I think Donald Trump sees Europe as a potential market for American energy, and Russia in that geoeconomic context is a competitor. And same in the case of China. I think we may see, everybody expects Donald Trump to be very, very, very hawkish in China. He actually may surprise people there as well. So basically what we are having right now is an actual decision maker who assesses each and every situation in the context of the value proposition. And those who will be working for him, I hope this time around, unlike the first time around, will be able to effectively communicate the value proposition of any action they want to undertake or advise them to undertake, which last time was not the case. If you recall, Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis, there was this reported session in 2017 where the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, all brought Donald Trump into the tank session in the Pentagon to do an intensive course about the liberal international order, the rules-based order, and why these allies are so special. And this whole thing was predicated based upon just a very simple question that the president had, which is not a gratuitous challenge. It's an actual question to elicit the value proposition, a first principles question. Namely, why are we having our military deployed to protect countries that do not pay for their own defense and who are killing us on trade? He's eliciting an actual response. And that was perceived as some sort of a fundamental challenge because no one had asked that question in Washington for at least 30 plus years since the end of the Cold War. And so no one knew how to answer it. And they all believed that that question was in and of itself destructive and disruptive and dangerous. But the truth is that he really wanted to understand, why are we doing it? And if you can't explain that, you may get an affirmative answer, or maybe actually a foreign policy that may not be that radical, but he does necessarily want to make sure that we are in a solvent position, that we do not waste our treasure and blood, but that does not necessarily mean that we'll completely retrench. So I wanted to leave you with that sense of statecraft as not completely captured to precedents and always thinking about policy as setting a future precedent, but evaluating each and every one of these decisions on its own merits, within its own political, domestic, and international context, and the American national interest first and foremost in mind. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm sure this has been said already during this conference, but it's a very big victory, and I see everybody is full of glee, probably in proportion to how dejected the left is right now. And it's partly because we have witnessed this arc of redemption, which I haven't really seen in my lifetime in politics on a grand scale, a kind of doggedness. All the world is against you, assassination attempts, and yet you persevere, your spirit is never broken, and that, in a way, is a more meaningful articulation of what culture can mean than how we usually think of it. It's these virtues in a soul. I think that we should remain very much on guard because it's possible for big victories to lose steam very quickly. And the left is dejected. You know, a lot of people like to laugh, but they're not down and out. No way. There are losses that they'll have to take, major losses. There are a couple of categories of losses. One is the people who have been on the left, have been Dems, maybe big donors, but have wanted an off-ramp for a long time. And so one such person is Jeff Bezos. He tweeted, I think this is a really precisely written tweet. I'm going to read it to you guys. Big congratulations to our 45th and now 47th president on an extraordinary political comeback and decisive victory. No nation has bigger opportunities. Wishing Donald Trump all the success in leading and uniting the America we all love. He never would have done that 4 years ago. And he is a representative of a class that is very careful about how he uses his voice. And he's deployed it because he wants a truce. And I think that it is too narrow to say that he simply has business interests before the federal government. I think there's something more here. And I don't like that motive because it's like, everybody is only a calculator, but we're more than that, and I suspect that he's more than that too. He's wanted an off-ramp for a long time. It took some courage to fire the people at the Washington Post. That's not an easy thing to do. And he defended himself, and then he moved on. No apologies, just moving on. He wants an off-ramp. There are a lot of people like that who have been supporters. There are some that are confused right now, devastated on the left, but they will find the fight in their souls. It's not over, obviously. There are some that will want deals and truces, but I don't think that the left can really easily back off of the ideology that it's been driving at for these last 15, 20 years. No matter how many people abandon ship, their voting coalitions depend on these ideologies. And when you think through what happened in the 70s with basically busting up a lot of unions on whom they depended for coalitions, you see that after that they turned to other coalitions that they cannot abandon and for whom they drive a lot of these ideologies. There's a lot of money and a whole spoils system involved in it too that you can't just back off of. Now, my task is to talk about culture. I give you guys a little preview of it. I think that culture is not a very good word. It's a vague and in a way phony word. Leo Strauss talks about its origins. He says that it's really an invention of Spinoza and then a reinvention of Nietzsche. It's an attempt to create genuine, deep belief with the background of the truth of nihilistic modern natural science. And so it's an attempt to replace the divine with some kind of value that maybe at first you believe in when this project is very interesting and exciting, but then it terminates in like the culture of shopping and these kinds of things. It can become very narrow and boring and empty. And yet still, there is something to our culture or who we are, and I think that the core of that and how we ought to think of ourselves is self-government. That we are a Republican people, we're a free people. And that, I think, better captures how we talk about culture rather than talking immediately, what you think of immediately when we talk about culture. Family policy, abortion, trans issues. I think it's really about a self-governing people. And the habits of mind and character that sustain that. That's what's at stake. Now, I want to think through the meaning of that and how we should hope to progress this game that we've had in this last week by talking about one dynamic of the election that is like so obvious that if an author wrote it in a fictional novel, you'd think that like he's gone overboard. And the characterization is this: that you had the most celebrated human type on one side, the most celebrated human type by the regime on one side of the election. That is the minority woman who is unimpeachable in her judgments, who is pure in her soul. That is the regime's teaching. And then on the other side, you had a very brash, very aggressive enemy of the state, some white guy. And that was maybe not the exact way that people chose for whom to vote, but it was clearly there, and I think it actually ended up being, in a way, representative. Everybody felt that the DEI candidate with her very low testosterone husband, who's a perfect match for the DEI regime. It's funny, but it's actually perfect. Like, this is a little manifestation of that hope for what the country ought to be like. Everybody felt that out of that emanates the kind of HR demand for conformity, the smiling face with a dagger hidden behind that suffocates maleness, that suffocates brilliance, that rules through its pettiness. And then this other side of this very brash, very aggressive, but very brilliant and unique and unconstrainable male. And the combination with Elon ended up being quite perfect, because as all of these political debates were taking place as the campaigns were reaching their crescendos. Everybody saw these images of enormous rockets going into the air. And you can't help but be impressed by another person that's a bit like Trump, the forcefulness of character that can make, through his ingenuity, through his brilliance, through his doggedness, these enormous pieces of metal without state help go up into the air. It's pretty amazing. And I think that that is one of the most important dynamics that we should build on in three regards. As you know, the biggest vote, the biggest surprise, although I don't think it should be surprising, vote for Trump was the male vote. It was men who saw this, who came out from not voting before, and who don't like being ruled by the DEI model of rule, who don't want themselves, when they look at the two side by side, who should I model my life on? Who ought I aspire to be? Should it be like Elon and Trump, or should it be like Doug Emhoff? Which one really, towards which one ought my soul gravitate? And, you know, it's not a 100% vote. There are some males, I think, that say, yeah, Doug Emhoff, I really like that guy. I want to be like him. And then there are a lot of others that don't. And so the three, I think, main readouts are, if the 2016 coalitional realignment was working class from left and right combined, then this one was not only, but one element of it was a demographic realignment of white, Latino, and black males. That is I don't do these kinds of demographic deep dives very often, but I suspect that this was the biggest time that there has been such a concentration together, which is, in my view, very welcome. And they saw something in the nature of these two guys that they admire. And they were very polite, you know? Everybody, every young guy that's been through school has been told the same things that I don't even need to repeat here. But the basic summary is like, you know, there's something evil about your nature. And we have a bureaucracy that's gonna really teach you. And so what they did this time was they voted politely. You know, all together, almost all together, and politely. And that's, you know, how things are settled politically in a liberal democracy. The second kind of revival that's possible, and here I'm going to go a little far, especially far in my third one. Revival, this is a renewal of the hope and anticipation of a lot of people that were so-called black-pilled for the last 4 or so years that thought, you know, it was over. And I would remind people that that's a very bad thing to carry in your soul, because the truth is it's never over. And the truth is that you have a great deal more capacity for self-rule in various places than we thought. And the problem is that you can never really judge, it's very difficult, I should say, to judge with full certainty your political moment. You know, everybody, like this meme about the end of Rome is constantly circulating. But the empire lasted for 400 years. And you don't know how many times during those 400 years there were a lot of guys that were like, oh, we're black-pilled, it's over. And then it kind of veered back, and it wasn't. You know, and you don't know what moment you're in. And I think that we're actually in a moment of a lot of hopefulness, where there is this renewed energy, this renewed belief that we have some levers of power, some capacity to rule ourselves right now at the national level, and certainly almost always at the level of the states. And the black pill is bad because it's ultimately self-flattering. It's like, I know necessity. And you don't know necessity. Maybe you do, but not on this. So a renewal of our political spirits, a renewal of our political spirit, which I think for now, for the next 4 years, maybe 12 years, will be at the national level. But it's especially at the state level, and we should not forget that. That is the place where you are closest to political power. And that is a place, those are places where there is, on the one hand, much need for very talented people to be involved in and not only think nationally, but in addition, it's the place where there's way more room for statesmanship than there is at the national level in a way because of some of the arguments that Mike made, that there's a vast bureaucracy that will constrain you. But at the state level, I'll just give you one example of this. 10 years ago, nobody thought that DeSantis could really put Disney in its place, for example. And he did a lot of other very good things. There's a great deal of room for creativity. And here's the last thing, and this is the most, you'll think that this is the most outlandish, but the issue is that we don't know where we are, so it may not be outlandish. I do think that there is a kind of possibility of a revival of the West. I'm sorry, everybody says this. I really hate when people overplay this. Now we're going to, we might or might not, but there is a possibility. And that possibility, I think, exists because there are new alliances that are being created that I don't think will be very easily disrupted of East versus West, of Russia, China, and others versus West. And that does, having an enemy like that, or let's say an adversary or a competitor, allows you to keep your competitive edge, to re-examine what precisely you're about. And I think that it'll come in a more interesting way than before, because in many ways, I think the era of globalization is likely coming to an end. It wasn't necessarily because of Trump, but he pushed it. There will be more, I think, reshoring. There will be more attention in the future to national sovereignty. And that allows a people to look at itself again as a people and its traditions, and how it grew to the power that it had, and allow itself to revive some of those strengths that still exist in various suppressed ways along the way that Professor Wax said. That some of these fixes are not actually that difficult. Once you are in the atmosphere that we are a nation and we're on our own, and we have to kindle those old capacities for renewing our strength and energy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and feel free to check out one of the recommended videos.